Well, it's past 3 o'clock, and I want to welcome all of you on behalf of the Shawnee County Historical Society. Thank you both, all of you who are participating. This is the fifth in a series of Zoom seminars that we've held this winter, and they're all presented by the Shawnee County Historical Society. In the past 2.5 years, we've had 35 of these joint conferences on various subjects, and I've appreciated that you folks have joined us. We have 3 scheduled later this spring. Next week, we'll be talking about drugstores, the history of drugstores here in Topeka. I'm Bob Totten. I'm the Executive Director for the Shawnee County Historical Society, and Doug Wright will be joining us in a few minutes. He'll be talking about French families and the history and what they brought to Topeka. It's a great topic, and it apparently is very interesting to a lot of you folks because this is a great group. Of course, we don't have National Football League to watch at this time. The Wichita State game was just concluded. Unfortunately, they lost. In the meantime, I wanted to, as usual, tell you that I would love to have you as a member of the Shawnee County Historical Society. It costs you $35 for a single membership and $50 for a household. Doug's a member, and I'm sure he's already given us $35 for this yearly membership. You can join him by sending money to us to Box 2201, Topeka, Kansas, 66601. Household membership is $50 so that you can include your spouse. And if you're not, if you are a member and haven't renewed your membership, we sure would like to have that done. I'll introduce Doug at this point in time. Doug, as you know, is a well-known historian. He's graced us with his presence past on another subject, and both his dad and he there, and they have loved the city of Topeka, and so I think this is easy for Doug to spend time being involved in this process. I'm getting a little feedback, so I'm a little worried about that. But Doug, at this time, we'll turn it over to you and give us what you know and what you found out. You do an excellent job on this stuff, so I appreciate you being with us too.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. I've got a PowerPoint. Let me see if I can find it and get it up here so that we can enjoy that together.
And we see it.
Okay, good. There it is, Topeka's French Pioneers. Let me begin by welcoming everybody. And let me also tell you that I'm not French, and I don't speak French, and that'll become obvious as I try to pronounce some of the names of some of the French towns where these folks came from. And I never took French in high school or college, and I don't think I have any French blood coursing through my veins. So how'd I get here? Well, about 5 years ago, I was reading about Philip Billard, the Topeka aviator, who's the namesake of our municipal airport. We were approaching the 100th anniversary of his death in World War I, which occurred on July 24th, 1918. And in Topeka, his heroism and his memory was celebrated by the Rotary Club, of which he was a member. I knew our friend Joan Wagnon was a Rotarian, so I contacted her and I suggested that the Topeka Rotary Club hold a 100th anniversary celebration of Philip Billard's life. And she turned the tables on me and suggested that maybe I should give a program on his life to the Rotary Club, which I agreed to do. And as I researched his life and the life of his family, I became engrossed with the story of the Billard family, how they fought for the French Republic, eventually fled France, and came to America seeking the freedom that we so often take for granted here in America.
Doug, just a minute.
Yes.
We have only on your screen your name. It worked initially where we had the shared, there it is now, at least on mine, but we still just have your name. So apparently maybe you turned off your video inadvertently.
Well, let me see.
Your camera.
Okay.
I apologize for interrupting you though.
Well, that's quite all right. Where is my?
Probably is in your lower left, but I'm not dead sure.
Can't get my Zoom back up, but can you see the PowerPoint?
Well, I see it in a small way. Now you're back up. The video of you is up.
Now I'm back.
Let's see if you can share.
My video is still on, so let me try this again.
Now it says it started your screen sharing.
Okay.
Then you go away. For some reason, your picture goes away. And now we're screen sharing your Google Drive.
Well, I can't see that, so let me see.
Well, now we have your feedback.
Yeah.
The folks that are watching recognize that Doug and I did not work on this prior because we're pretty used to, just having this work. But we're running into some technical.
It's not pulling up here, is it?
No, and
Let me. Huh.
let me see if there's a reason for me. Let's see.
Well, it's sharing it, but then I can't see it to open it up. Let me see if I can open it up and then get it.
Now we have full screen of your presentation, which will be sufficient. Your video for your face is not there, but we'd rather look at
Yeah, the PowerPoint's a little bit more interesting, I think.
Well, yeah, well,
it should,
at least initially. There you go, full screen. We have your PowerPoint.
Good.
Okay.
So what I found about researching the Billard was
have that thing right over it so you can't see them.
Okay, if anybody, you need to mute your audio, please.
So I hope you can see it, because when I was researching the Billard family, I found that their life was intertwined with the Sardoos and the Laurents, and also a man named Camp Doris, who was a heroic Frenchman who chose to settle here right at the time of Bleeding, Kansas, and who, in my opinion, deserves a little bit more recognition. These four families all fled France and somehow ended up settling here and helped build our city. In the course of my presentation, I'm going to talk about Democrats and Republicans, but I'm not talking about the U.S. political parties. I'm talking about people who love democracy, who support democracy, who supported the French Republic, and who opposed the monarchy, and were also known as anti-royalists. So first off, we have to have a quick review of some French history that is important to Topeka and important to our story. In 1848, Alexis de Tocqueville, who toured America and he was the author of Democracy in America that was published in 1835. In 1848, he said, "We are sleeping on a volcano. A window of revolution blows. The storm is on the horizon." There was a lot of social and political discontent at the heart of France in February of 1848. There was still a monarch in France at the time, and after 3 days of rioting in Paris and more than 50 deaths, Louis Philippe, the last king of France, abdicated, and the Second French Republic was declared in France. Louis Napoleon was a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. He was elected to be the first president of the Second French Republic to serve a 4-year term. And all 4 of our families opposed the monarchy and supported democratic concepts and principles, and they supported Louis Napoleon. These families that ended up in Topeka all came from different parts of France. They didn't know each other in France, and they were called Democrats and Republicans and Constitutionalists and Anti-Royalists. And at least with regard to Billard, Sardoo, and Camp Doris, and perhaps Laurent as well, they were called Socialists. Generally, what they supported was the ideals of universal male suffrage, the abolition of slavery, the abolition of the death penalty, and the establishment of certain programs within the state, such as right to work and national workshops. On December 2nd, 1851, and I've got that highlighted because that's an important date in French history, but it's also an important date in Topeka's history. December 2nd, 1851, this is 3 years into Louis Napoleon. I'm getting some feedback here, so maybe somebody has their microphone on, I don't know. They were 3 years into his term, and just about 3 years before Topeka was founded, Louis Napoleon, this democratically elected president of France, executed a much rumored coup d'etat. He abolished the republic, he restored the monarchy, and he named himself the Emperor of France. He did this in part because democracies are messy, and monarchies, for all their faults, offered stability. And all 4 of our families were outraged. And as democratic Republicans, they took up arms against Louis Napoleon and the French military that he'd persuaded to support him. They took to the streets and they spoke openly, advocating resistance. And as a result, their lives were upended. So we're going to start off first off with Gilbert Dillard. He was from Saint Leon, France, in the Department of the Allier. And as you know, in France, the departments are similar to states. The Department of the Allier, I've circled it right there. It's about 220 miles south of Paris. It's right in the middle of France. It's a mountainous area. It's an area with a lot of small towns in it. He had actually served a short time as mayor of Saint Leon, and he was well known as a political activist and a troublemaker. Or as the charging documents read later on, he was a great agitator of the region. In 1850, he had held a banquet for his Republican friends at his house. And this is his house. This is called Puy St. Ambroise, and it was a priory at one point, but it's in St. Leon, and that's where the Billard family lived. And there was a time when assemblies were prohibited by law, but he held this banquet anyway and had the audacity to raise a red flag of the Democrat Socialists on his house in protest. And for all of his political activities, at one point he was thrown in prison for 30 days. The day after the coup, December 3rd of 1851, Gilbert Dillard organized his circle of red friends in St. Leon. And I've got a Google map showing that St. Leon is circled up there at the top. That's where the Billard family led. He led his insurgents over here to Ladon John, which is over here on the right side of the map. And that was about 13 kilometers away. And there they rang the church bells continuously to alert all the Republican leaders in the area to assemble. And once assembled, Gilbert Dillard was named the Government Commissioner Provisional. He directed the insurgents to execute a plan to take the sub-prefecture of La Police, and that's down here at the bottom, and I've circled it. It was kind of like the county seat of this area where they lived, a little bit larger town, and they were over here in Ladon John, and Dillard's plan that he informed them about was to attack La Police from both sides. He was going to have these insurgents in Ladon John head down to La Police. He was going to go back to St. Leon and march over here to Joligny and then attack from down here. And he would be gathering insurgents along the way. So he's back in St. Leon on the morning of December 4th. He put on his red scarf because that's how they distinguished all the insurgents. He confronted the mayor of St. Leon, who had the French tricolor on. And he ordered the mayor to turn over the town's rifles to his insurgents, saying, You no longer have any authority. I'm the government commissioner provisional, and you must obey my order. And after they exchanged threats, the mayor backed down, and Billard and his band of insurgents headed to Joligny, about 9 kilometers away, armed with the town's rifles, plus their own hunting rifles and a few pitchforks and torches. And on the way to Joligny, Billard and his Republican army passed through the village of Châtel-Perron, and that's over here just a few kilometers away from St. Leon. When they got to Châtel-Perron, the mayor tried to stop him. They arrested him. They took him to Joligny and they threw him in jail. Many more Republicans from the other nearby towns poured into Joligny until there were about 500 insurgents led by Billard, who ordered the church bells to be rung. And then he and his Republicans took over the town, walked about waving a red flag, singing La Marseillaise, and shouting, "Long live the Democratic and Social Republic." The mayor of Joligny viewed the insurgents as rioters and tried to stop them, but instead he was thrown in jail also, along with the mayor of Châtel-Perron. And just as they were preparing to leave and march to La Police, they got word that a gendarme had been killed in La Police, and the National Army was on the way to occupy Joligny and quell the uprising. So Billard realized his band of Republicans would be seriously outnumbered and outgunned, left him no choice but to disperse his band and send them home. But in the morning, Billard made one last attempt to organize a resistance force with the miners in the nearby town of Bert and Montcombeau, and those are the 2 towns there in the middle. He was persuasive and had assembled a small group of miners when the manager of the mine spoke to the wives of the miners and convinced them to stop their husbands from going off with Billard. The wives won the day. Billard, exhausted, realized his insurgency had failed, and he repaired to a nearby inn where the army found him and arrested him. And over the next couple of months, military tribunals were held, which resulted in judgment being passed on the insurgents. A few of them tried to save themselves by pointing the finger at the leaders, singling out Gilbert Dillard. One said, "Billard knocked on my door and told me to come, and he said, if you don't walk with us, I'll shoot you." Another claimed he only wore a red scarf and then just for 15 minutes because Billard gave it to him and made him wear it. 2 men simply testified the leader was Billard. The mayor of Joligny gave a damning report fingering Billard as the leader of the rioters, and the tribunal found it was wrong for Billard to arrest the mayor of Châtel-Perron. And at the end, Gilbert Dillard and a few others received the harshest punishment, banishment to an island off the coast of Cayenne, French Guiana, South America. And this was the first use of this island prison that over the decades became known as Devil's Island or the Dry Guillotine. And 3 months after his arrest, Billard found himself on a prison ship taking him to South America. At Devil's Island, Billard later said he knew he would die of malaria or yellow fever or some other tropical disease if he didn't escape. After 4 months there, he and a small group of prisoners were able to escape, taking a fishing boat to Paramaribo, a town in the neighboring country of Dutch Guiana, now known as Suriname. From there, he wrote to his wife, Antoinette, back in St. Leon and told her to pack up the 2 boys, Charles and Julius, who would become known as J.B. Billard in Topeka, sell everything and meet him there in Paramaribo, where she did find him suffering from malaria. She nursed him back to health and found a sympathetic boat captain who took the family to New York City. Gilbert worked as a baker, and the family took in boarders to make ends meet in New York City. And in 1854, Gilbert read about Kansas Territory being open for settlement and decided that would be their next home. They arrived in Westport, Kansas City in the summer of 1854, where they met Charles Sardoo and his family that consisted of his wife, Josephine, and their infant son, Freeman. Now, Charles Antoine Sardou was born near Carquerien, France, in the department of the Var, and that's way down in the lower right-hand corner of France. I've got it circled there, on the French Riviera. He was born in 1813. He was 41 years old at the time of the coup. He was probably a relative of Victorien Sardou, who was a prominent French dramatist of the day. Charles, though, was a sailor, and his life was one that no dramatist, not even Victorien Sardou, could have dreamt up. Charles sailed the seas for 23 years, and at one time he was shipwrecked and lived alone on an island for 13 months. In 1850, before the coup, Sardoo was working as a cork maker in Hyères, near Marseille. He caught the eye of the authorities, though, who noted that Sardoo's commitments were resolutely socialist, and he was designated as one of the 10 most active militants of the socialist democracy movement in Marseille. After the coup was declared, Sardoo organized and led the crowds of militants and urged them to take up arms. But the French military arrived, dispersed the crowds after Sardoo had worked them to a fever pitch, and while some were taken prisoner, Sardoo and his wife Josephine escaped. In his absence, the military court placed a price on his head of 20,000 francs, reporting that he was a dangerous demagogue who had managed to exert a fatal influence on the cork makers, who he managed to pervert by his disastrous doctrines. He was sentenced in absentia to be deported to Algeria and spend 5 years imprisonment if and when he was caught. Sardoo and his wife managed to escape to the Kingdom of Sardinia, and along with 16 companions, they seized a ship and sailed to America. On January 16th of 1854, while on the Atlantic Ocean en route to America, Sardoo's son, Freeman Sardu, was born. He was given the name of Freeman because, of course, he was born a free man. Freeman Street in Oakland was named for him. 120 days after leaving Europe, the boat arrived in America in New York City. The Sardoo family made their way to Westport, Kansas City, where they met the Billards. But the question arises, did they know each other in New York City? It's not clear. J.B. Billard did make it clear why the Billards came. Their father had decided that Kansas Territory is where they were going to settle. There's nothing that I've uncovered to tell me why the Sardoo specifically came, but I think it's fair to say that they might have known one another in New York City. There was, after all, a large settlement of French expatriates in New York City. In any event, at Westport, the Billard Sardoo party looked for land in the area and met with some half-breed Indians who told them about the good land they would find to the west in the area we now know as Oakland. They hired the Indians to lead them to the place, and the party arrived in August of 1854, some 3.5 months before Cyrus K. Holliday and 8 other men founded Topeka. Gilbert Dillard and Charles Sardoo laid out adjoining 160-acre tracts, and at the time, they were just about the westernmost point of American civilization. Now, this is a map from 1898, but it does still indicate to you where the tracts were. The street running from the left side of the map to the right side of the map is Sardoo Avenue. To the north of that is the Billard property, and that was the Billard tract. To the south of that is the Sardoo property. And you can see that there's still a little area that is owned by Freeman Sardoo on that property, and an area owned by J.B. Billard. This is 1898 now, some 40 years later or so. But that gives you an idea of where the property was that they laid their tract out on. J.B. Billard recalled their first night at the new home. He said they huddled under an oak tree in a driving rainstorm. In the morning, they found some dry driftwood, built a fire, and warmed themselves. Gilbert tried to build a log cabin, but he was sick with ague and was unable to work, so the family dug out a cave along a hillside, covered it with branches, and kept warm as they could throughout the winter. For food, they found wild potatoes and artichokes along the Kansas River. Eventually, Gilbert built the house known today as the Billard Mansion at 1400 Northeast Sardoo, where he and his family lived. It started out, though, as a 2-room house and was expanded over the years. Charles Sardoo built the house, or built 3 houses, in fact. They kept getting destroyed. His first house was a dugout by the side of the Kansas River that was washed away by a flood. He replaced it with a sod house that was destroyed by a windstorm, and his third house, a log house, burned to the ground on November 23, 1854. 2 days later, the holiday party passed through on their way to founding Topeka. Sardoo and his wife and infant son crossed the frozen Kansas River and spent that first winter camped with the Indians near Silver Lake. And in 1855, he returned to his farm and found a claim jumper named Martin living there. He had to go to court to prove his claim and oust Martin from his farm. this thing didn't come across very well. This is a copy of a copy of a copy, I think. There was a land patent signed by President Buchanan that assigned him 120 acres of land dated June 15th of 1860. And similarly, Sardoo received a land patent signed by President Buchanan for his acreage dated August 10 of 1860. Now let me introduce you to Dr. Marie Antoine Eugene Jacques Campdoris, MD. He was born in the Pyrenees Orientales department in September 6th of 1825, and that's on the Mediterranean as well. It's down there at the south part of France. He was the oldest of 7 children whose father was said to have been a patriot who mixed Republican ideals with Bonapartism. And it was written about Campdoris that his Republican convictions were ardent and enlightened by a thorough understanding of French Revolutionary history. He definitely was a man of strong conviction. After graduating from medical school, he joined the French Navy as a surgeon. In 1851, Campdoris was assigned to the ship, the Penguin, based in Saint-Tropez on the French Riviera, and from that town, he came into contact with the many Democrat socialists in the Department of the Var. That's that's where Sardoo was from. And he perhaps even came into contact with Charles Sardou because the maritime authorities deemed Campdoris to be an agitator who they said would gather friends in his room in order to spread his exalted opinions. As with Gilbert Dillard at one point, Campdoris was singled out by the authorities for his political views and for 30 days was subjected to what was called rigorous arrest. Campdoris was on board the Penguin when the coup occurred, and upon learning of it, as his ship returned to port, he immediately declared himself as a staunch Republican, and he left the ship, never to return to the Navy. As it turned out, he was one of the few and perhaps the only naval or army officer to desert rather than carry out what he believed to be unlawful orders. It was written of Campdoris that he recognized that the time had come when all true patriots should strike for freedom and against tyranny. Campdoris had a strong bearing with thick black hair and a beard. He was smart and he spoke intelligently, and it was clear that despite his youth, he was only 26 at the time, he was destined to take a leadership role in the uprising in the Department of the Var. And this is the area of the Var. The circle at the very bottom there is Hires. That's where Sardou was. Over here on the far right is Saint-Tropez, and that's where the Penguin, the ship, was docked and where he left the ship. As Gilbert Dillard had, Campdoris organized his men and had them wear the red scarf as a badge of honor. And as they marched off, they were going to march up into the mountains, believing that they could pick up more insurgents along the way and gain strength as an army. They marched off yelling forward, forward, and Viva la Republic. They played patriotic songs and they sang the Marseillaise. They had their red flag unfurled and they had drums that they used to keep the beat as they marched. Campdoris led his handful of troops to Gasson, which is the town just outside of Saint-Tropez, just south of it there, where he ordered the seizure of the guns. And then they headed up further north to Vidabon, where they joined other insurgents, perhaps 800 strong, where Campdoris was offered a leadership role of the assembled Republican militants. And at that point, he deferred to another, an older man who proved to be a weak leader. This guy preferred to spend time reviewing his troops rather than leading them into battle. Campdoris and the Republicans marched further north to Draguignan and eventually were camped at Ops, which is the town at the very top that I have circled. And they were working on their plans to attack the French army when the French army surprised them and routed them. Campdoris and the men under his command, though, held their ground and were the last to concede defeat. Many were captured and others were forced to flee. And the author of A History of the Insurrection wrote later on, if all the soldiers and leaders of the revolution had been of the caliber of Campdoris, the insurrection of the Var would have been formidable in its results. As it was, Campdoris fled to the nearby kingdom of Sardinia, and in the spring of 1852, he sailed from Genoa to America unaware until years later that he had been condemned to life exile to Devil's Island and probably certain death for the leadership role that he played in the insurrection in Navarre. He practiced medicine in New York City for 2 years, and in 1854, he moved to Louisiana, where a lot of French expatriates ended up. But he couldn't tolerate slavery. He was sympathetic to the plight of the slaves, and in 1855, he moved, of all places, to Kansas, to Bleeding, Kansas. And at first, he lived with the Gilbert Dillard family in a dugout near the present Billard Mansion. Then Camp Dora, still a single man at the time, settled on a farm near Indianola, which oddly was a small town with pro-slavery leanings just northwest of Topeka. It's a ghost town now, but I believe it was located north of the present-day Goodyear plant, south of Soldier Creek, where the Fort Riley and Fort Leavenworth roads crossed. Now let me introduce you to Louis Jean-Pierre Laurent, who was born in 1815 in the town of Joux-la-Châtel, a small town about 60 miles southeast of Paris in the Seine-et-Marne department, which I've circled there on the map. As a young man, he joined the French army and served with distinction in Algiers. Afterwards, he was appointed to the prestigious position of postmaster of the nearby city of Provence. And this shows that department, shows Paris over there on the left side. The top circle is the town of Joux-la-Châtel, where he was born. The town over on the right is Provence, and that's where he became the postmaster. He was an ardent French Republican who the authorities said used his position to take an active role in distributing Republican literature. And when Louis Napoleon staged his coup d'etat, Laurent, who had the misfortune of living too close to Paris, was arrested along with the other known Republicans and jailed at Nantes. That's the town at the lower left that I've circled. Laurent wasn't allowed the opportunity to forcibly resist or organize an insurrection, which I have little doubt he would have done. At trial, he was sentenced to be guillotined for what were referred to as his fearless utterances against the monarchy in whatever form. But before he faced the guillotine, his sentence was commuted to life exile to Cayenne, French Guiana, Devil's Island. As fate would have it, Laurent knew the jailer, who was sympathetic to his plight and assisted him and his two cellmates to escape. The jailer agreed to be tied up and gagged while the three took off. They went to a friend's house where they acquired a set of surveyor instruments, and they headed towards the border of Belgium. They had several close calls, being confronted by the police on more than one occasion. They told the authorities that they were surveyors laying out a line for the railroad. Their ruse worked. After they arrived in Belgium, Laurent made his way to England and had his family meet him there, where he worked for a while giving French lessons, and his wife Louise worked as a seamstress. Later, they booked passage to New York, and 7 weeks later, the family of two adults and their two daughters, Zomi and Hermance, arrived in America in New York City in 1852. And while in New York, two more children, Louis Charles and Clarice Marie, were born to the Laurent family. The family of six arrived in Topeka in February 1859. And a fifth child, Regina Laurent, was born in Topeka in 1865. Again, the question arises, did the Laurents know the Billards or the Sardoos while they were in New York? Again, I believe it's likely they did. There's nothing in any of the writings that give evidence as to why specifically the Laurents came to Topeka, Kansas, other than the fact that they possibly knew Billard or Sardoo. In any event, Louis Laurent arrived in Topeka in 1859, and he erected one of the first store buildings on Kansas Avenue at First and Kansas, across from the sawmill, where he opened a grocery and a general store. His son, Louis Charles Laurent, wrote a long letter in 1913, and it is this letter that is preserved with the Kansas State Historical Society and which has been written about in several Shawnee County Historical Society bulletins, which is the source of much of the information about his father and his family. Louis Charles said that on their way to Topeka, the family first stopped in St. Louis, and then they went to Leavenworth. And in Leavenworth, his father met up with businessman Thomas Kearney, who was in the wholesale grocery business. Kearney would go on to become the second governor of the state of Kansas, and Laurent used his relationship with Kearney to build and maintain his grocery and general store business in Topeka. In the 1880 U.S. Census, Laurent, ever the entrepreneur, listed his occupation as capitalist. Louis Loret took an active role in the defense of Topeka after Quantrill's raid on Lawrence in 1863. Rumors were that Quantrill might be headed for Topeka, and Laurent served as a sentry on the roads from Tecumseh and Lawrence and helped build a fort, which his son recalled was near 6th and Kansas. An article appearing in the North Topeka Times in 1878, written by none other than Charles Curtis, recounted the history of North Topeka and the role Louis Loret played in it. Curtis wrote in the article, "Let me skip now to the year 1865, when North Topeka, or Eugene as it was then called, was first laid out by William Curtis and Louis Loret." Charles Curtis then writes of Loret building houses and, of course, naming a street after himself. And if you asked anybody in Topeka today who they believe Curtis Street in North Topeka was named after, I'm sure you'd get the answer, Charles Curtis. Well, in fact, it was named after his grandfather, William Curtis, because at the time the streets were laid out in 1865, Charles Curtis, born in 1860, was but 5 years old. So in 1867, then, 2 years after the streets were laid out, Eugene was annexed into the city of Topeka and became known as North Topeka. So these are the four men and their families, all French expatriates who settled in Topeka a few months before our founding and in the years after, and in the words of Charles Laurent, they came to this land that they might better their conditions in regard to freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom from tyranny, equal opportunity, and equality before the law. So what became of these individuals and their families? Well, first off, attitudes were changing in France. In 1859, Emperor Louis Napoleon granted amnesty to the leaders of the French Republican uprising. So all of these individuals and their families were able to return to France if they so desired. So let's take a look at each one of them and see what happened. In 1858, Dr. Camp Doris, 3 years after arriving in the area, married his neighbor, Eliza Reeder. Now, she was the sister of well-known early Kansas pioneer Samuel J. Reeder, who had participated with James Lane in the Battle of Hickory Point in Jefferson County, Kansas, and whose comprehensive diaries are on file with the Kansas State Historical Society. The marriage ceremony between Dr. Camp Doris and Eliza was conducted by Reverend J.T. Holliday, the brother of Cyrus K. Holliday. Camp Doris and his wife would have 7 children, 2 sons and 5 daughters. Dr. Camp Doris participated in some of the border skirmishes with his brother-in-law, Samuel Reeder, and in 1862, this man of strong convictions and who opposed slavery enlisted in the 2nd Regiment of the Kansas Home Guards under the command of Colonel John Ritchie. He served as an assistant surgeon, but he was also a regular soldier, and he took part in the Battle of Cane Hill in northwest Arkansas, where his horse was shot out from under him and killed, and he was injured. After 18 months of service to the Union, he returned home to practice medicine and to farm. He took an active role in the Grange movement and was a leader of the many French settlers who came to the Topeka area. In 1879, Dr. Camp Doris was thrown from his carriage and suffered paralysis of an arm and an inability to speak. So the next year, 1880, he returned to France to make inquiries about his health. And apparently his health improved somewhat as he returned to Topeka. But in 1881, he died at his home at the age of 55. His wife, Eliza, died in 1919. But interestingly, she received a widow's pension from the French government for the years her husband had served in the French Navy, and despite him being a deserter. During the early years of World War I, she donated her pension to aid the French cause. The fact that she received a pension reflects the changing sentiments in France, where the insurgents of 1851 were, as time went on, considered to have been heroes. The Camp Dorises and the Reeders are among the first families to have been buried at Topeka's Rochester Cemetery. This is the Camp Doris stone, and you can see on that the year 1881. You can also see an anchor at the very top in the circle to indicate his service in the Navy. In a letter Campdorus wrote from New York to a friend in France in 1852, he summed up his feelings about France and America, saying, and I've said it out here, "O sad France, country of cowards, I do not know whether I have love or hatred for you. My dear, you must make up your mind. Men of the old world, your time is over. You are in decline, France. You're in decline. France, which is said to be the heart and brain of Europe, is dead. There's nothing more to hope for her, and her resurrection is impossible. It is here, it is in America, that has passed the soul of humanity." Charles Sardoo farmed on his acreage and prospered. Sympathetic to the plight of Negro slaves, he opened his house to travelers along the Underground Railroad. In 1870, Sardoo, probably with the help of Campdorus, raised $4,000, largely from French settlers in Kansas, and returned to France because Emperor Louis Napoleon had gotten France in trouble, and he was in trouble. He'd gotten France involved in war with Prussia. The Franco-Prussian War was raging, and there was new talk of a revolution that would reestablish the Republic. Sardou was one of 1,000 French exiles and immigrants who left America to fight for a new French Republic. He participated in battles in Strasbourg, Metz, and Sedan, and when the Third French Republic was declared, he headed home back to Topeka. But he brought with him this book, a history of the 1851 insurrection in the Var, written in 1869 by a lawyer from Toulon, France, named Noël Bloch. And Bloch extols the virtue, character, and heroism of many of the insurgents, but in particular, he singles out Dr. Campdorus. Most of what is known about Dr. Campdorus's leadership in the insurrection comes from this book. And when Sardou returned and spread word of the book, Dr. Campdorus was celebrated all over Topeka as a hero of the French Republic. In 1883, Charles and Josephine Sardu went back to France and settled in Carquerian, his hometown. He died in France in 1894 within a stone's throw of his childhood home in Carquerian, and was buried in the Old Soldiers and Sailors Cemetery there. During his funeral, the trains in France were ordered to stop for 1 hour to honor this unique French patriot. And after his death, he was honored along with other French heroes such as Hugo, Danton, and Robespierre as deputies for life in the French Chamber of Deputies. Josephine Sardu stayed on in France until 1910, when she returned to Topeka to live with her son Freeman, who had built a house and planted a fruit orchard on the Sardou property, raising fruits, nuts, and berries. The house was originally on Freeman Street, but as a result of street name changes, it is now addressed at 702 Northeast Grattan and is owned by Benjamin Albright, and is still standing today. In 1890, Freeman established the Sardou Cannery, where he canned fruits and sold them locally, promoting the freshness and purity of his products. And Freeman and his sons, Charles and George, were recognized as heroes of the Kansas River flood of 1903. It was written that the river surged to a point where it was 5 miles wide in places, and thousands were stranded on rooftops in North Topeka. Freeman and his sons owned 4 boats, and they used them to rescue 200 people. And each of the Sardou men were awarded gold medals by a grateful city for their heroic, tireless service in raging floodwaters. The picture on the upper left is Freeman in the middle, his mother Josephine to his left, his son Charles to his right, and his grandson Charles Jr. in front of his father there. The Sardou Street Bridge was first built in 1899, connecting Sardou Street in Oakland with North Topeka. It washed away in 1903. It was rebuilt again and washed away in the 1951 flood. It was rebuilt again in 1961, where it now stands, connecting Sardou Street in Oakland, not with Sardou or Gordon Street or anything like that in North Topeka, but Morse Street. The ribbon was cut in 1961 when it was reopened by George Robert Sardou, a descendant of Charles and Freeman Sardou. The Sardou family that was in Topeka is buried at Mount Hope Cemetery, and this is their stone showing Freeman, his wife Mary, and Josephine. Louis Jean-Pierre Laurent prospered in Topeka. His daughter Zoe married a soldier named Etienne Boulet, who was himself an immigrant from France. Their daughter Lydia married William Bowman, and they had 9 children. Some of their descendants remain in and around the Topeka area. And in the course of putting this together, I spoke with Diane Rodenbaugh and her partner, David. And I talked to, I think it's her uncle, Don Bowman, and his daughter, Barbara. And they helped me fill in gaps about the Loret family. The Rodenbaughs grew up on a farm in St. Mary's. I just heard that Dennis Rodenbaugh, who's now the president of the Dairy Farmers of America, give a Wake Up with Washburn talk. Daughter Hermance Laurent attended Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York, and then married J.B. Billard. Son Louis Charles Laurent was educated at the Sorbonne in Paris. He worked as a railroad clerk in Wichita and ended up living in Denver. Daughter Clarice M. Laurent studied music at Bethany College in Topeka and at the Cincinnati Conservatory, then went to study art under Boulanger, Rondel, and Lefevre. The paintings that are shown on the slide were done by Clarice Laurent. The gentleman is William Bowman, who married Lydia, the daughter of Zomi. She did a lot of portraits and she did a lot of still lifes. Youngest daughter, Regina, also went to Paris to study art. Regina, who was born in Topeka, met and married a Frenchman who oddly took her last name as his. And they lived in Argentina and had two children named Anita and Marcel. And when Regina died young, Anita returned to Topeka to live with her Aunt Clarice. Anita taught in the Topeka Public Schools and was a charter member of the Topeka Association of Family and Consumer Services, which is still active. It was founded 99 years ago in 1923. The portrait on the right is a portrait of Anita that was painted by Clarice. And I am led to believe that it was presented to Cedar Crest, the governor's residence, as Clarice requested in her will, and has become a favorite with the state's leaders and their families. When Anita died in 1973, she left her estate in trust for scholarships for K-State and Pittsburgh State students, where she had attended school. And over the years, the Anita K. Laurent Scholarship in Human Ecology has awarded more than $400,000 to deserving students. Clarice Marie Laurent developed into a talented portrait and still life artist who, after returning to Topeka, became the superintendent of the art department at the Kansas Free Fair and a charter member of the Topeka Art Guild. In 1904, Clarice Laurent exhibited a few of her paintings at the St. Louis World's Fair to much acclaim. Many of her paintings can be viewed at the Topeka Public Library, Mulvane Art Museum, Meade Garden Center, and even the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. In 1886, Louis Jean-Pierre Laurent and his wife Louise returned to France for a brief trip. And then upon their return, they moved to Wichita, where their son Louis Charles lived. Louis Jean-Pierre Laurent died in 1890 and was buried in Wichita's Maple Grove Cemetery. His wife died in Denver in 1912 and is buried in Fairmount Cemetery. Gilbert Dillard established a farm on his original acreage and began building his house. But in 1860, the man who had survived malaria, yellow fever, and ague caught another fever. He caught gold fever. He leased out his farm and his family headed west to the Colorado gold fields, settling in the South Park area near the present-day town of Fairplay. He placed an ad in a Topeka paper, the Weekly Commonwealth, and that's the ad there for the St. Rain Hotel, which he operated in the gold region, Hamilton City, South Park. Yes.
For some reason, we're not seeing the pictures, and we haven't for a period of time. We see the notations, but we don't see the pictures. I'm not sure you can do anything about that, but it does trouble us, I guess.
Well, it troubles me too. I'm sorry, because they help enhance the presentation, but we'll go ahead with it. I'm almost done anyway, so we'll finish it up.
Okay, that's fine. Go ahead.
The advertisement read, Mr. G. Billard of Topeka is the proprietor of the above establishment and is prepared to give the best accommodation in his line to be had in the Rocky Mountains, either for man or beast. He hopes to merit a liberal patronage. Signed, Gilbert Dillard. The Billards were in Colorado when the Civil War broke out. The Billards' oldest son, Charles Billard, was one of the first volunteers enlisting in the 1st Colorado Regiment, part of the Union Army, and was tragically killed on March 28, 1862, in a clash with the Confederate Army at the Battle of Apache Canyon, also known as the Battle of Glorieta Pass, New Mexico. In 1864, Gilbert Dillard and his family returned to Topeka, and he added on to his house and lived on his farm until his death from lung fever in 1870. He was 54, and he was survived by his wife, Antoinette, who died in 1901, and his son, J.B. They are buried at Topeka Cemetery. Gilbert often spoke about returning to France, but he never did, saying he was a Kansan now. J.B. Billard graduated from Washburn College in 1870, the year of his father's death, intending to become a teacher. Instead, as a result of his father's death, he felt compelled to go into business, eventually becoming very wealthy. He also served as mayor of Topeka from 1910 to 1914 and ran unsuccessfully as a Democrat for governor of Kansas. J.B. married Hermance Laurent, the second child of Louis Laurent, and they had 3 boys, Reamer, Robert, and Louis Philip Billard. Reamer moved to New Mexico and eventually El Paso, and he prospered in the real estate business. There are several generations of Billards descended from Reamer, but I don't believe any of them live in Kansas. A couple of them are participating in this presentation today and are part of the audience. That would be Stephen Billard and Andy Billard Cook. And JB's wife, let's see, Robert ran the family business, and he and his wife, Lila Billard, moved into the Billard Mansion upon his mother's death in 1901. And JB's wife, Hermance Laurent, died in 1913 at the age of 63 and was cremated. Philip died in service to America in World War I in France in 1918 and was buried in a U.S. military cemetery in France. In 1924, his brother Robert and his wife Lila went to France and had his remains exhumed and cremated, and they then spread Philip's remains and the remains of their mother Hermance in Provence, the town of Hermance's birth. In 1938, Robert Tutt Billard donated Philip's airplane to the Kansas State Historical Society. It had been stored in the mansion's garage. There's a well-known photo that is on Kansas Memory showing Kirk Meacham of the Kansas State Historical Society, Senator Arthur Capper, Mayor Herbert G. Barrett, and Robert Tutt Billard at the time of the presentation of that airplane that we've all enjoyed when we've gone to the museum. It had been stored in the mansion's garage for years. In 1858, Robert Billard fought the city to save the Billard Mansion from destruction. The city wanted to take the property and the house in order to provide right-of-way for the new Sardoo Bridge. But Robert's pleas were heard, and according to newspaper accounts, the city agreed it would not tear down the house so long as Billard or his wife occupied it. It's no longer occupied by any Billards. It's owned now by Richard and Jamie England. J.B. Billard died in 1935 at the age of 90 and was buried at Topeka Cemetery next to his mother and father. Robert Billard died in 1961. His wife Lila and he are memorialized at Topeka Cemetery. But there's one final chapter in the Gilbert Dillard story. In 1903, on the 50th anniversary of the Revolution and the uprising that Gilbert Dillard led, the St. Leon Town Council decided to honor those who fought for the Republic by giving their names to the streets of St. Leon. The street leading from the center of town to Gilbert Dillard's house was renamed Rue de Proscrit Billard, which translates as Billard the Exile Street, and the name of the street remains to this day. On my PowerPoint, I had a Google map photo of St. Leon, and if you zero in on it right in the center of town, you can see that the name Rue de Proscrit Billard is still on that street to this day. The marble plaque read Gilbert Dillard, 1816-1861, mayor of St. Leon, exiled to Cayenne following the coup d'etat of December 2, 1851, died in exile. This tablet has been placed here to honor the memory of citizen Billard, who was subjected to deportation and exile for having defended the Constitution of the Republic against the criminal attempt of December 2nd, 1851. Proceedings of the Municipal Council of July 19, 1903. This slab of marble is placed in the boys' school of St. Leon near the street Billard the Exile. And in 2003, less than 20 years ago now, the old and strong Republican traditions from the Department of the Allure were celebrated once again. Mr. Andre Munier prepared a brochure entitled Billard the Exile from Puy St. Ambroise, his house, to Cayenne, which detailed the uprising in St. Leon and described Gilbert Dillard as a beautiful, heroic figure who provided inspired leadership to the insurgents. In St. Leon, a ceremony commemorating the insurrection was held and described as follows. In period costumes, children, school staff, and parents of students marched to Gilbert Dillard Street, where a new plaque was inaugurated in the presence of the mayor, in the presence of the town council, and the many visiting dignitaries. Speeches were given tying the historical events of the 19th century to the present day, warning that France is still yielding to the demons of Bonapartism and hoisting the red flag, the symbol of the Republicans. A professor of history and a native of St. Leon, J.P. Gay, retold the events of 1851 and said, one of the rights of democracy is to revolt against the excessive powers of the elected representatives. He suggested that St. Leon could use Billard's fight for democracy and defense of the Constitution of the Republic to promote itself as the most democratic village in France. The memory of Gilbert Dillard, one of the two Europeans to settle in the Oakland area, Topeka, continues to be revered to this day in his French homeland, and he's remembered as an exceptional man and one of the noblest Frenchmen of his time, as are all these men. Charles Sardoo, a French deputy for life. Dr. M.A.E.J. Camp-Doris, hero of the insurrection in the Var. And Louis Jean-Pierre Laurent, one of the fathers of North Topeka and the patriarch of a family that is still giving back to others. These were all exceptional men, the men and their families who helped build Topeka. And that's the end of my presentation, and I will be glad to answer any questions or entertain any comments that any of you have. And again, I apologize for the PowerPoint. It would have enhanced the presentation, but we make do with what we have.
Thank you on behalf of our organization. We really appreciate the time and effort put together on this. And I find it interesting that they had a lot of political power or desire in France, which I had no knowledge of. Any of you have any questions, please open up your mic. I'm sure Doug will be glad to talk about whatever your question may be.
Would it be possible to get a copy of your presentation so we can see what the pictures look like?
Yes, I will make sure that you get one, Stephen.
Thank you. I'm
glad you were able to join us today. Stephen Billard is, help me out. You are descended from Reamer.
From Reamer. My father was also J.B. Billard. So we, and my sister Andrea is on the call as well. We got these stories verbally from grandparents and parents while we were growing up. But it's nice to see everything put together. We didn't hear so much about the other families, so it's nice to hear about them. And it's nice to get, some confirmation of what was probably correct and some questions about some of the other things that are different in the family history. For instance, the family story is that the Devil's Island prisoners stole a skiff from the guards and sailed to Guyana. So we don't know.
And the story I read was that they were just about to be captured when they entered the Dutch Guiana area and were protected by the Dutch.
Yeah, the further on that story, what we were told is that they escaped on the skiff. They got chased by the frigate. The frigate, being French and somewhat arrogant, and I can say that since I have that heritage, did not salute the Dutch flag when they came into port, and so the Dutch wouldn't let them land until that brouhaha was cleared up. And by then, Gilbert and his comrades had escaped into the jungle.
Yeah. Where do you live, Stephen?
I live in Southern California, Huntington Beach.
Okay. Other comments or questions?
Doug,
Yes.
this is Chris. I
Yes.
just wanted to tell you thank you. You know, this is all so new to me. Just thank you, and wow, what a lot of research you've done. This is just marvelous.
Well, thank you. I had a lot of help. As I mentioned, some of the family members who've helped over the years. I also got a nice note that Bob forwarded to me, Bob Totten did, from Lorraine McMillan, who provided me with the information about the Topeka Association of Family and Consumer Sciences and the Anita K. Laurent Scholarship. So I appreciate receiving that. All of that helps with the presentation.
Well, it was just great, Doug. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other comments? Questions? Doug, you've done a great job. I mean, I've enjoyed the previous presentation and the amount of research and involvement that you do when you make a presentation like this. It shows up here, as Chris mentioned, and it did with your baseball presentation to us, I guess, over a year ago. Does anybody else have any other questions for us, or for Doug, I should say?
Well, let me just thank everybody for participating today. I enjoy doing this. I enjoy the research, and I enjoy sharing it with others. And so
Well,
I'm
we
glad
will have
that
you back, Doug, with another project. I want to say, what are you working on? But I'm sure you're not working on anything right now.
well, I will start working on something else tomorrow now that I'm done with this. And I'll let you know what it is.
By the way, I know several people wanted to have your PowerPoint, and you'll send that to me, and then I can get that to several of the folks. If anybody wants that PowerPoint, send an email to me at shawneecountyhistory@gmail.com, and I'll get that to you.
I will see that that's done, yes.
Folks, next week we have Lisa LaRue Baker, who's going to be talking about Charles Curtis and the Curtis Act, which is somewhat something that you may not be aware of, which seemed to be against or not as friendly to the Native Americans as it could have been. That'll be next week at 3 p.m. The following week, Mark Law will be talking about drugstores, and then we have Michelle Cuevas Stubblefield for our last of the seminars this spring. I have nothing else at this point in time. Thank you all. Doug, thank you again for your presentation today. We hope to see you next week or the weeks following. Have a good afternoon.